Chapter 20. Trade in a flourishing state. The benefits conferred thereby to the employed in it. The natural logic of religion. Its fallibility when put to the test. The moment at which Mchl Armstrong entered the cotton mill at Deep Valley was a critical one. The summer had been more than commonly sultry, and a large order had kept all hands very sharply at work. Even at dead of night the machinery was never stopped, and when one set of fainting children were dragged from the mules, another set were dragged from the reeking beds they were about to occupy, in order to take their places. The ventilation throughout the whole fabric was exceedingly imperfect, the heat, particularly in the rooms immediately beneath the roof, frightfully intense, cleanliness as to the beds, the floors, and the walls utterly neglected, and even the persons of the children permitted to be filthy to excess, from having no soap allowed to assist their ablutions, though from the greasy nature of their employment it was particularly required, while the coarse meal occasionally given out to supply its place was invariably swallowed, being far too precious in the eyes of the hungry children to be applied to the purpose for which it was designed. In addition to all this, the food was miserably scanty, and of a nature so totally unfit to sustain the strength of growing children thus severely worked, that within a fortnight after Mchl's arrival an epidemic fever of a very alarming description began to show itself. But it had made considerable progress before the presence of this new horror was revealed to him. Notwithstanding all the hardships of the Brookford factory, no infectious disease had ever appeared there, which it is possible might have been owing to the fact that the majority of the laborers in it lived at a considerable distance, thus ensuring them a walk morning and night through the fresh air. This, though it added to their daily fatigue, probably lessened the danger of it, while the wretched hovels to which they returned for their short night's rest, miserable shelters as they were, reeked not with the congregated effluvia of 50 uncleansed sleepers in one chamber. Mchl, therefore, had never before witnessed the hideous approach of contagion. The general appearance, too, of the Deep Valley troop was so far from healthy that the sickly aspect of those first seized upon was less remarkable than it would have been elsewhere. Thus another week wore away, during which, though several of those who had been working when it began were withdrawn, and known to be in the sick ward ere it closed, the fact that an infectious fever was among them had not yet got wing. "Poor dear Betsy Price," whispered Fanny Fletcher to her friend Mchl, as they sat side by side at their miserable dinner one day. "I heard Mrs. tell master that she was dead, but I'm trying to be glad for it, Mchl." "Glad, Fanny?" replied the boy. "You told me that you liked her more than any other girl in the mill, and now you are glad she is dead?" "I am not so glad as think I ought to be," replied Fanny gently. "She will not be hungry in heaven, Mchl, nor will she work till she is ready to fall, and surely God will give us green fields and sweet fresh air in heaven, and there must be flowers, Mchl. Oh, I am quite sure of that, and Betsy Price will have it all. Ought I not to be very, very glad?" Mchl looked in her sweet, innocent face as she said this, and tears filled his eyes. "And if you die, Fanny, must I be glad too?" "If you thought about heaven as I do, and if you loved me very much indeed," replied the little girl, "I can't tell how you could help but being glad." "But I do love you very much indeed," said Mchl, almost choked by his efforts not to cry. "And I do think of heaven too, Fanny, but couldn't I be glad if you was to die? I couldn't be glad if you was to die." "Not when you hear that, Mchl," said Fanny, starting up as the lash of the governor's whip resounded through the room as a signal that numbered their moments of rest were over. "I suppose, then, I love you better than you love me, for I could not help being glad if I knew that you would never hear or feel that lash again." When they met again at supper, Mchl, though still unsuspicious of the cause, missed 3 more children from their place. He fancied, too, that there was something new and strange in the aspect of their hard-featured female tyrant. She was paler than usual, scolded not at all, and when she spoke to her husband it was in a voice that hardly exceeded a whisper. Yet, notwithstanding this, some young ears again caught words that told of death. Yet still the mill worked on, and nothing seemed to mark any calumny more than usual had got among them. By degrees, however, the growing pestilence burst forth, as it were, before the eyes of the terrified children, and they knew that the grave yawned before them. Then it was that the ghastly countenances of each doomed victim struck dismay into the hearts of their companions even before they were permitted to leave their labor and sink down to the rest that should be disturbed no more. But still the mill went on, for Mr. Elgood Sharpton had just received a glorious order from Russia, and it would have been perfect madness, as this gentleman was heard to remark to his eldest son, if a death or two amongst the apprentice children was to check the mill at such a time as that. So the mill went on, and death went on too. But as it is considered by all parties concerning to be extremely important that the cry of epidemic contagion should not be raised in the neighborhood of a factory under these circumstances, it was deemed best by Mr. Elgood Sharpton and his confidential managers not to call in medical assistance. First and foremost, Poulet, said the experienced proprietor to the governor of the apprentice house, first and foremost, it is of no manner of use. I never knew any proper, regular contagious fever in my life that could be stopped short by a doctor. You must take care of yourself and your wife, of course, and I will see that you have a hamper of good old port sent in, and mind that you both of you take 2 glasses a day each, Poulet, one before you go into the rooms in the morning, and the other after you have seen them all down for the night, and we must order in a cask of vinegar to sprinkle the chambers. Trust me that this will do more good than all the doctors that were ever hatched. Besides, the vinegar cask will never sing out, you know, Poulet, and the doctor might. To this reasoning, and to the arrangements, no objection whatsoever was made by the governor of the apprentice house. Of athletic frame and iron nerves, he grinned defiance at any danger that threatened his own person, rightly enough thinking, perhaps, that any disease to which his water-porridge-fed troop appeared so peculiarly liable would be little likely to attack himself. It was, however, not the least part of his wisdom upon this occasion that he systematically paid as little attention to what was going on around him as possible. Had he made it a habit to look into the haggard faces of the drooping children, as one after another they pined, languished, and sunk first into the horrible abyss of wretchedness called the sick ward, and then into the grave, it is possible that he too might in some degree have been shaken. As it was, however, he went on so cleverly supplying the missing hands by recommending to the manager that 1 healthy children should do the work of 2, and so cleverly also getting all that died by day buried by night without making, as he said, any fuss or fidget about it whatsoever, that Mr. Elgood Sharpton felt him to be eminently deserving of an especial reward, and when 15 children had been noiselessly buried in Tugswell churchyard, he presented him with a Bank of England note for £10, as a testimony of his esteem and gratitude for his very exemplary and praiseworthy behaviour. It fared not quite so well, however, with his wife. Whether it were that the poor Pococurant system was less within reach of her position than his, or that her frame was less stoutly proof against the malaria with which she was surrounded, a visible change came over her about 3 weeks after this visitation had first been felt at the Deep Valley Mills. Strong in constitution and athletic in form, it seemed, however, no easy matter for disease itself to conquer her. The large dark eyes grew dim, and sunk back behind her high cheekbones by degrees. Her coarse, firm-set features appeared to relax, and her active limbs to languish for 2 whole days before she yielded herself to the invisible power that had seized upon her. It happened during this interval that Fanny Fletcher and Mchl, in their eagerness to communicate to each other their observations on the rapidly increasing sickness of their fellow labourers, hung back together as the frightened train swept on before the lifted lash of the governor, and permitted nearly all their companions to reach the mill ere they had left the supper-room. They were perhaps themselves unconsciously how much they were emboldened to this hardy defence of standing law by the unwonted stillness of tongue and tameness of aspect observable in Mrs. Poulet. But if they fancied that they were to escape entirely, they were mistaken, for whilst the little girl was telling Mchl they ought to always, at work or not at work, to be thinking of God, who was perhaps thinking of them, and meaning to take them both up together to his own happy heaven, just as she had laid her hand on his to enforce her words, and looking wistfully into his face, pronounced aloud, "Do, Michael, do." The sick dragon stepped back on hearing them from the passage that led into the kitchen, and turning her ghastly face full upon them, exclaimed, while her languid fist strove in vain to clench and raise itself, as in days of yore, to threaten castigation, "Do, you devil's imps! I'll do ye, off to your mules by or by." But ere she could finish the sentence, her fever-laden sinews relaxed, and seizing upon the long table for support, she sank, almost insensible, upon a bench. Greatly terrified, both Michael and Fanny screamed together, but they screamed in vain. There was no longer any one within hearing save the closely packed chamber above, where more than 20 sick children lay 2 and 2 together in their miserable beds, but totally without nurses or attendants of any kind, so that their loud cries, though heard by many, brought assistance from none. "Oh, Michael, Michael, she'll die too," said Fanny, shuddering. "I would make her live longer if I could. She is not fit to die. Go to the pump, Michael, and fetch water. Go, go, dear boy. We must not leave her this way." The little girl endeavored to raise the woman's head, which had sunk upon the table, but the effort was beyond her strength, and feeling after a moment's reflection that the best manner of assistance her would be to call others, she cried, "No, no, don't go, Michael. Don't go for the water. It's no use my trying to hold her up, and besides we don't know if it's good for her or not. Oh dear, how dreadful bad she looks. Let us run away to the mill, Michael, and tell the master." The seizure of Miss Poulet, unlike every other, became, within an hour from its time it was known, the theme of every tongue throughout the whole establishment. Had it been Mr. Elgood Sharpton himself, it could not well occasioned a greater sensation. The effect this produced throughout the sickly troop might have served as proof of the wisdom of a government when it conceals the mischief it has brought upon an empire from those who are likely to discuss it. The total silence which till now had been preserved among the managers and overlookers respecting the contagious nature of the malady which had got among the children, the absence of all medical attendance, and of all precautionary or medical measures in any way calculated to excite attention, had hitherto very successfully prevented rumour from doing her usual work on such occasions, and it is probable that this partial ignorance of their own danger considerably lessened in its consequences, for it was only 1 or 2 such thoughtful, meditative little things as Fanny Fletcher, who had begun to remember having heard of infectious fevers, and to think that maybe it was something of that sort that had made numbers 9, 16, 18, 19, etc., 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 stay away so long, and that too when the mill was so very busy. But when it became generally known that the awful strength of Mrs. Poulet was laid low, and when the words, "the fever have cotched her," had once been pronounced aloud, the palpable image of the pale tyrant seemed to stand frowning in the midst of them, substituting his grisly hourglass and scythe for the fist and the frown he had conquered. The scene which followed this was very frightful. Those upon whom infection had seized sunk from their work at once, despite the goading thong which had hitherto kept them from dropping, as the spur and lash sustained the failing post-horse, while those who were yet untouched looked in each other's faces as if to watch who next should fall. When the children from all the different floors of the fabric met together at their midday meal, the first thought of each seemed to be the finding out who was missing since the last they assembled, and the shudder that followed the perceiving another and another and another gone ran along the shortening lines with an agony which grew more and more intense as their numbers lessened. When things reached this state, Mr. Elgood Sharpton agreed with Mr. Poulet that it might perhaps be as well to let an apothecary from Tugswell visit the factory, to which reluctant decision 2 reasons strongly contributed. The first was, that though with his usual forethought he had divided his nocturnal burnings between the churchyards of Tugswell and Mennington, the clergymen of both had declared that their frequency rendered it necessary that some inquiry should be made into the cause of so great a mortality; and the second was the fact that the mistress of the apprentice house, being herself at the point of death from the same malady, must infallibly prove to the medical visitant that it was no treatment peculiar to the children which had occasioned it, but it had come beyond all possibility of contradiction by the visitation of God.